that's the temptation of anger, and what makes it so deadly is that anger gets you to violate your core values so that your behavior is the opposite of your core values. And that's where unhappiness comes from. And one of the things that I think that it does is it opens you up to a stronghold in your life. You know, I got into a conversation with my son Jake the other day, and he just said, Dad, well, welcome everybody to the Salty Pastor Podcast. Our goal is to coach you up in your faith. And what that basically means is helping you understand what you believe and why you believe it. I'm not here to tell you who to vote for, what music to listen to. I'm not here to tell you who you're supposed to marry or whether you should be married. I'm not here to tell you what kind of diet you should be following or what church you should be attending or what worship style is most spiritual. I'm not doing that. All those decisions you need to make for yourself. And the reason why, because when it all boils down, it basically comes to what do you believe and why you believe it, because that's where your faith is rooted. My goal is to help you think for yourself. My goal is to help you make your own decisions. I talk a lot about the history, the philosophy of where things came from so that you're informed. And what it does is it kind of coaches you in how to think for yourself and how to analyze arguments, the usage of logic and rhetoric. All of these are lost skills in our world today. And it's one of the reasons why so many people are lost and confused and wonder what life is all about. And that's why the Salty Pastor Podcast exists. It's not about me. It's about you. And it's what I can just share with you that's going to help you do you and also live and navigate this thing we call life. So that's what the Salty Pastor Podcast is all about. If you could go over to our YouTube channel and like and subscribe, you can also watch me on video. Not that there's anything exciting about that, that's for sure. But it is definitely an opportunity to grow this thing and share with your friends. Also, you can go to our website, The Salty Pastor, and you can go there and you'll see me there. And one of the things you can do is you can donate to help support this ministry because it has become its own standalone ministry. Now, we are currently in a series called The 7 Deadly Emotions. And if you're just a new listener, let me bring you up to speed real quick. And that is Aristotle in the 4th century BC, that's before Christ was born. He kind of talked about the 7 virtues. And he had a really interesting kind of frame of reference, and it's really influenced philosophy for a long time. Now, 400 years later, Jesus shows up and he totally starts to transform the world. And it's been slow, it's been steady, but it is unbelievable in its growth over 2,000 years. Now, Aristotle, he postulated 7 virtues, and they are trust, compassion, courage, justice, wisdom, temperance, and hope. And what's interesting is after Christ came, died, and rose from the dead, the early Christians started following him. And then in about the 3rd century was a early church father, very well-respected scholar, who became a monk by the name of Evagrius Ponticus. And what he did is to help people kind of grow in their faith. It says, well, Aristotle had 7 virtues, and these virtues are very similar to the virtues that Paul wrote about in Galatians chapter 5. Now, if you're not familiar with those, we discussed them last week a little bit, but it's basically where Paul says in chapter 5, don't live by the flesh, because if you do, you'll reap the deeds of the flesh. And he says it's hate, malice, bitterness, and so forth. He says, pursue the Spirit, live by the Spirit, because the fruit of the Spirit is evident. It's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, perseverance, and so forth. So Evagrius said, well, if those virtues that Paul wrote about reflect Aristotle's 7 virtues, then maybe we can understand the 7 deadly sins. And even though the 7 deadly sins don't actually exist as a list anywhere in the Bible, some people have argued that in Proverbs chapter 6, verse, I think 16, that those are the seven deadly sins. But that's kind of a bit of a stretch if you use that passage for that, but doesn't really matter. And he said the seven deadly sins were anger, envy, gluttony, greed, lust, pride, and sloth, which is known as laziness or extreme procrastination. And what we did is we thought, okay, we went back and we look at kind of that philosopher who was a sociologist who also wrote about the stages of man that we've gone through. And what he meant by that is the way in which mankind determined, discovered, and expressed their identity of what it means to be a human being. And he said during the Greek philosopher time of Socrates and Plato and even Aristotle, it was the political man. And that is that we have a civic responsibility, and that is how we express who we are. And then once Christ came, it became the religious man. And that is that we are all pilgrims on a spiritual journey. And all the way up until about the 1500s, 1600s, that was very effective. And then it became the economic man. And the whole point of the economic man is that we discovered our identity in our capacity to produce or generate economy, take care of ourselves and all that, those types of things. But in the early 1900s, it shifted, according to Reef, to the psychological man. And the purpose of these categories is to just get handles on it. They're not exact, but they give us handles on what is going on in America today. And that's why I decided to call this the seven deadly emotions as opposed to the seven deadly sins. And the reason why is because we are living in a postmodern context, and the inner person, what you feel, dominates everybody's process of thinking. Now, if you're a new listener, one of the things I say a lot is this: look, it's not so much what you think, but it's how you think about things that makes the biggest difference in your life. And so postmodernism has driven over the past 50 years the notion that your feelings should drive your identity and your decision-making process, your very nature or your identity. And so I call that emotional logic. And that's a departure from 2,000 years of the notion that there was an objective truth that you could discover and it could mold and shape your life. And that's what I call logical or rational thinking. And so what's really interesting is the goal is not to get rid of your emotions in this study. It's not to denigrate emotions. It's just to have emotions fit in their proper place. And because when emotions get out of control, they have a tremendous impact on your life. For instance, one of the things I love to do is read studies and research and so forth. I dig into all that kind of stuff. And you could go to the National Institutes of Health, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Cancer Society, you could go to the National Library of Medicine, you can go to the National Library of Congress. What you find is research studies galore. There's millions of them out there now. And you can kind of do searches and look at them, and they're different. It's not like reading an article or an essay or a book or anything at all like that. And they start with an abstract, and then they say, okay, what did we prove, and did we prove it? And you can look at their methods and so forth. So I like to look through that stuff. And I was looking on the whole notion of how does our emotional state impact education? And Ann Rowe and Julia Fitness wrote a research article in the National Library of Medicine where they analyze the impact of emotions on learning in students. And what they found is something really interesting in their abstract, which is kind of like the introduction, is they said this: look, there are 4 categories of discrete negative emotions: anger, sadness, fear, and boredom. And these were considered by teachers and students to be especially salient in learning. So what that basically means, salient means extremely causal in their impact on the learning process. And then they added this with self-conscious emotions. So they listed 4 emotions, and then they listed 3 more for a total of 7. And they are self-conscious emotions, and they are guilt, embarrassment, and shame. And so they said the self-conscious emotions are mentioned more by students than by staff, which I thought was really an interesting insight. But that's for a whole nother podcast. So basically, let's take what they analyzed and dig into it. They said that there's anger, fear, sadness, and boredom, guilt, embarrassment, and shame. And let's look at the biblical selection of emotions that we discussed last week. And they are this: anger, fear or anxiety, despair, which is perpetual sadness. The Bible calls that despair. Number 4 is boredom. Now, boredom could be similar to sloth or laziness, or it could be connected to lust. We'll have to dig into that later. Then there is shame, and then there is a sense of, the Bible talks about lostness or emptiness or being dead in your trespasses and sins and other types of things, which is interesting because that could be lust, right? The desire to want to feel something instead of being dead. So I think it's really interesting. Now, what we're going to do this week is I want to talk about anger and how anger is a deadly emotion in your life, but you got to understand how, because the first question is anger really deadly, or is it the management of anger that is deadly or not? And I thought, well, there's so many different references to anger in the Bible. As a matter of fact, if you just run a search real quick on BibleGateway.com, it's like almost 300 different references to anger. So it's in there a lot. And what I think is interesting, though, is I wanted to go to a situation with Jesus in Mark chapter 3. Now, this is, most people, when they talk about anger, they always go to Jesus when he purged the temple. And I want to go to a different one, and I want to read it, and we're going to talk about anger and try to learn some things, okay? Verse 1. Now he, meaning Jesus, entered again into a synagogue. Now, a synagogue, I guess you could kind of equate that to like a Jewish church, but it's more also like a community center, and everything goes on there in every village. And so he stopped at one of these places and went in there. He says, and a man was there with a withered hand. Now, in a synagogue during the week, like Monday through Friday or Sunday through Friday, they have school. They also, that's where business meetings and contracts would take place. That's where judgments could be rendered. It's just all kinds of stuff happened. And so it's a lot like a community center. But on the Sabbath, you could walk there. You could only walk a certain number of steps, though, on the Sabbath. Any more than that would be considered work or labor. You weren't allowed to do that. And then you would have a religious ceremony, usually the reading of the scroll or whatever. So on a teaching and so forth. Jesus was there on a Sabbath. And so it says, and verse 2, and they were watching him. Who's they? Well, it was the Pharisees, to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Okay. Oh, wait, let me back up real quick. Jesus entered the synagogue, and there was a man there with a withered hand, and they were watching him to see if he would heal on the Sabbath in order that they might accuse him. Now, isn't that interesting? He says, look, Jesus was at a synagogue. There was a man with a withered hand who'd been going to the synagogue for years. Jesus shows up, and so they show up because they want to watch what happens to see if they can accuse him of something. And so he says to the man with the withered hand, rise and come forward. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill? But they didn't say anything. Now, what Jesus is doing here is he's talking about the point of the Sabbath, because the Sabbath had all of these, first and foremost, the 10 commandments, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy or whatever, you need to have a day of rest, right? In the original writing by Moses, and when he revealed the 10 commandments and that whole thing. And so the Jews were required to take a Sabbath every week. What's interesting, though, is that over the generations, over the 1,000 years, what happened is the Pharisees made it much more complicated so that they could be real specific. For instance, you were only allowed to take so many steps. You were allowed to reheat certain foods, but you couldn't prep any foods because that'd be cooking and that'd be labored. You were allowed to do these types of things and not those types of things. It's very, very specific. But something in the Sabbath that was really interesting is that since it was agrarian culture, is that many people were on the Sabbath, if your animal falls into a pit or is attacked, you're allowed to protect your animal and you're allowed to save your animal's life on the Sabbath. And so Jesus is making a reference to this. And he's basically saying, look, even in the Sabbath, it's allowed to do these things because they're good things, right? After looking around at them, here's the most critical point. He says, with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, he says to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately began taking counsel with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him. Now, isn't this interesting? Because they were there to see if he would do something that they could criticize on the Sabbath. And so what they were looking for him was to manifest some form of work or some form of healthcare. Like if he goes up and touches him, or will he, spit into the dirt and make mud? Will he pick somebody up? Will he do something that could be construed as labor so then they could accuse him of violating the Sabbath, or Shabbat, as they would say. And what's interesting is that he knows this. He points out the point of the Sabbath was to do good, not to be evil or to kill, right? And then what he does is he doesn't touch the guy. He doesn't do anything that violates any of the standards of the Sabbath. He simply says, stretch out your hand, and the man is healed. And what's really fascinating about this is that you would think at this point that these Pharisees would go, oh, wow, maybe we're wrong. Wow, these are new facts. Boy, we should change our mind about this Jesus. But they don't. They're so angry and embittered towards him that what do? They go out and they conspire with the Herodians. And these are people who were loyal to Herod the Tetrarchy. It says, we are going to meet with you, conspire with you in order to destroy Jesus. So we can learn a lot of things here in this. Let's sum up the biblical principles. Number one, Jesus got angry. Jesus got angry at their hardness of heart. So what's interesting here is Jesus did get angry, but Jesus didn't sin. He didn't allow the anger to get him to violate his core beliefs and core convictions, okay? What's interesting that I find here is he deals with people who are angry, and what do these angry people do? They try to focus on the rule keeping. Isn't that interesting? They really focus on, well, he's going to violate the rules and we are going to get him. Anger does that to you. You miss the forest for the trees. You can't see the big picture. You're so intent on trying to destroy Jesus, they couldn't see the fact that he healed a guy that nobody had ever been able to do. And so that's a biblical principle here, is that anger, what it does is it really clouds your vision. And that's one of the reasons why it is a deadly emotion. The other thing too, is I think is really interesting, is notice how the anger opened the door to a stronghold or a foothold in the life of these Pharisees. They were willing to partner with the Herodians, which were their enemies. They did not like the Herodians, and yet they were willing to partner with them for the sole purpose of destroying Jesus. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting about anger, is it can open you up to doing something that you normally would never do. If you remember last week, we talked about how Jung's philosophy, and I showed a video of that guy talking about how unhappiness in your life comes when your actions are incongruent or contradictory to your core beliefs. And that's why you're unhappy. And I find this really interesting, is that that's the temptation of anger, and what makes it so deadly is that anger gets you to violate your core values so that your behavior is the opposite of your core values. And that's where unhappiness comes from. And one of the things that I think that it does is it opens you up to a stronghold in your life. I got into a conversation with my son Jake the other day, and he just said, Dad, somebody said a while back, you were talking about how Jesus, is God. He knows everything, and so he has foreknowledge, so he kind of knows what you're thinking, and You have the Spirit of God in you. And you said that Satan can't read your thoughts. But if Satan can't read your thoughts, then how does he influence you? Right? And I thought, oh, that's a really, really great question. What is clarifying here is this: Satan doesn't have foreknowledge. So Satan can't sit in there and determine beforehand or to influence what you're going to do. But what Satan can do is enter into any place you've given him permission to enter into. And the place that we allow Satan to enter into our lives is when we act in a sinful way because we're angry. Isn't that interesting? And the Bible actually talks about this. It says in Ephesians chapter 4, Paul is talking to the Ephesians, and he says, verse 26, be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil a place. Now, some translations will say an opportunity, but the actual Greek word there means a place. And so it's really interesting. You go, what do you mean a place? What does that mean? Well, if you flip over to Hebrews chapter 12, he talks about a place is a beachhead or a foothold. Notice what he says here. He says, pursue peace. This is verse 14, chapter 12 of the book of Hebrews. Pursue peace with all men and the sanctification without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness, and bitterness is entrenched anger, right? That no root of bitterness springs or grows up in your heart and causes trouble, and by it many will be defiled. So what happens here is that anger opens the door to allowing Satan to have permission to establish footholds in your life. And those footholds then are phrases, those footholds are beliefs, those footholds are misconceptions, those footholds are deceptions that are rooted in your mind, and those things will play back on you because you've given them permission. That's why spiritual growth is knowing what you believe and why you believe it. It's critical thinking skills. It's the ability to discern truth from lie in your own mind. And you purge lies. You purge falsehoods. You're removing any permission that Satan has to run that negative thing or those falsehoods in your mind to influence your choice of action. So anger in and of itself, I don't think, is the problem. What the problem is our inability to understand its influence and effect on our lives. That's when it becomes deadly. So let's apply this in our remaining time today before we get into really specific things. And I always like to phrase what we study on Tuesdays in biblical principles, okay? Number one, all human beings experience anger. The problem is anger becomes deadly when it overpowers your convictions. Notice Jesus got angry, but his actions were perfectly in line with his conviction. The biggest temptation getting angry, has nothing to do with the fact that you got angry. The biggest struggle, and that struggle is real, is not allowing your anger to overpower your convictions. If you remember that earlier principle that I talked about, unhappiness is a result of acting or behaving in a manner that is inconsistent with your convictions or your core beliefs. That's why anger becomes so deadly. It tricks you. This is the key. It tricks you into acting counter to what you believe, what your convictions really are, those core values. So what anger does is it tricks you into acting in a way that is inconsistent with your convictions, core values, and beliefs. Number two, most of the ways that we are taught to manage anger simply don't work. So if you think about it, this is where it really gets interesting to me. The real goal of most people in life is peace. We really want to be at peace. We want peaceful living. When you're at peace, people are happy. When things are at peace, love abounds. When there's peace, you get prosperity. Peace, peace, peace. We love peace. Women, they want peace and tranquility in their lives. They want to feel secure. They want to feel loved and valued. Unfortunately, because of all of the sin in this world, the subconscious drive for women is to control their relationships in order to have peace. This is where anger tricks us, okay? Because an initial sense of anger, which is not sinful at all, according to the scriptures, is designed to let us know there is a threat to our peace. All right? It's there to warn us. But if we act on the basis of the warning or our anger, we end up undermining or contradicting the very thing that brings us peace. That's the deception. That's the trick. You see, women want peace in their relationships and in their own lives. Unfortunately, the subconscious drive is to control their relationships in order to have peace. If they're married, their subconscious drive, and I've talked about this, it's the ramifications of the curse in the book of Genesis, is to control the men in their life. It's a subconscious belief that if I can control my environment, I'll be at peace. If I'm not married and I can find a man, then I'll be happier. And then once you find a man, okay, if I can get my man trained, if I can dial him in, then I'll be happier. You know, why does my man do these things that annoy me and make me angry? They make me feel insecure. They make me feel offended and hurt. They're undermining my security and my sense of value. And so I lack peace. And so what you do is you try to control your husband. You try to modify his behavior. You try to get him to meet your needs. And this is a subconscious drive where the thing that brings about anger, which is annoyance, offense, or whatever, to warn that maybe there's something that needs to be addressed in your relationship, ends up causing you to try to control the relationship, which ends up doing what? Undermining the peace. See how that works? Men want peace in their lives. They avoid situations and circumstances where things are not at peace. You know, they don't like creating conflict with their wife. The most dreaded words that most married men hear in their marriage is, honey, we need to talk. Because he's like, oh my goodness, what did I do now? How am I what happens is he will acquiesce to her requests and her demands, and he'll change things. Because when a woman says, oftentimes, well, I'm upset, he goes, why are you upset? The way a man's brain is wired is to fix it. She goes, well, I'm upset because this door doesn't work. And he's like, oh, okay, well, I'll fix the door. Well, I'm upset because we don't spend enough time together. Okay, well, let's spend more time together. Well, I'm upset because it wasn't your idea. And then he's like, okay, I don't understand how to fix all of these things. Now, the point here is that a woman is having a different conversation than the man is. And what happens is, so what men do is like, well, I'll fix the problem, or I'll acquiesce to whatever she wants because I want her to be happy. Do you remember the old cliche, if mama isn't happy, nobody's happy? Well, first and foremost, I think it's a terrible way to live your life, and it's very bad for your marriage. But a cliche is a cliche because it's true. And that is that men will acquiesce to their wives' demands in order to keep peace. It says in Proverbs, it's better to live on the corner of a roof than in the house with a contentious woman. So, men, I get it. You are acquiescing, you're bending, you're saying, well, it's a cost-benefit analysis. It's like, she's unhappy. Oh, it's just easier or cheaper to do this to make her happy. And what happens is that this doesn't end up solving the problem, moving peace to the marriage. What it does is they are little cuts that never heal. And it ultimately what? Increases anger. It increases insecurity. It increases distance and isolation, even in your marriage. So somebody's going to say to me, well, then why are men so attracted to violent sports like football and UCF? And why do they like war movies and things blowing up? Well, I think it's primarily appeals to their desire for peace. And you're like, what? Well, yeah, think about it for a second. Men are wired to be protectors. What are they trying to protect? Well, they want to protect peace. They want to protect their loved ones. And so men who are married will tend to, be attracted to examples and manifestations of men who are fighting for what's good and right and peaceable and would bring and protect people. So it kind of makes sense. They love watching sports because there are, ways in which you can compete and you can push yourself to, there's competition, but there's all these rules to mitigate anger and violence in the actual sport itself. So I think that it makes sense to me, and I think it makes sense to a lot of guys, but I know a lot of people won't make any sense to. So the other thing I wanted to point out here in our time together is that most of the ways in our society that we are taught to manage our anger simply don't work. All right? It just simply doesn't work. And so that's why in the end, anger is the enemy of your peace. If your desire is for peace, anger will work against you by making you fearful of losing your peace and then acting in a way that is incongruent with your core values. So when we get annoyed, we get bent out of shape, we get upset, we get offended, guess what? These are warning signs, accurately reflecting that maybe things aren't as good as they need to be. But what we have to do is when we experience those things is understand the influence of anger on us and how anger will try to use our desire for peace against us. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing you got to do is you got to strengthen your belief, because what you believe is one of the most important things about you. And so we're going to dig into this on Thursday in our application. And I think it's just going to be a really great time and very insightful. So you won't want to miss Thursday's episode at all on this one. So I'm going to drop right here with our Bible study and biblical principles on anger is one of the deadly emotions and why. And please go to our website, like and subscribe, donate, go to YouTube, like and subscribe. Let me get that straight. And so this is Salty Pastor signing off for today. I'll see you on Thursday. And remember, always think for yourself.